Hello, good evening, and welcome to SCOTONOMICS. Just give me 1 second, because it looks like we're not posting to Facebook with my little connection, so let me work on that. Thanks everyone for joining us. We've got a really fascinating interview tonight with Stephanie Seguino, economics professor from Vermont University. Kieran, while I just look at the little back end thing here, any highlights? Or it's been quite a big week in Scotland, especially around kind of climate and kind of environmental issues, thinking about the biomass ban as well. Any thoughts on the last week or so?
Yeah, so it's been quite tough on the Scottish government because they've dropped these targets and admitted that they're perhaps overly ambitious, which they were told in the first place. But it's quite an interesting phenomenon. Something that I hadn't come across until I was a councillor is that a lot of these public bodies they like to have stretch outcomes. So they are supposed to stretch both the civil servants and the legislators and councillors to a certain extent as well to reach targets or get as close to them as possible. Because if you put your target as 65% and you reach that, it's like everyone can pat themselves on the shoulders, but you're perhaps not really going as hard and fast as you maybe could be, because it was actually quite an easy target to reach. So I've been sort of responding to lots of groups on Twitter and saying, also, that when they're talking on Radio Scotland, they talk as if the Scottish government is a monetary sovereign. It's and again, more on Radio Scotland this morning on this as well. We want our governments to spend money on this, and it's the Scottish government have a budget. That's it. Should they take this money away from the police? Should they take it away from councils? Where would you like the money to be taken away from? So I think there's something about educating people about understanding where money comes from, again, which is why we do this show fundamentally.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I've just posted a link to a brilliant article in the New York Times, and it backs you up completely there, Kieran. And it's just saying, governments all across the world are having these problems, and it's not saying actually the Scottish government is pretty much maybe not quite a local authority, but certainly a lot less authority, or certainly no monetary authority, but economic levers and power than any of the states in the USA. And as one of my main points on the show is always that the Scottish government is putting itself up to fail when it says these things without saying we have only got a limited suite of powers. We cannot do these things. All we can do is try and push the UK government to back our proposals. And I think that's been a consistent message that we've had, that if you want a government to be able to do these progressive ideas that you support, you've got to have an independent country, and that independent country has to be powered with its own currency to be able to make those changes. So yeah, I thought that was really interesting. And I thought there was a little bit of the Scottish government saying we don't have the powers to do this, and maybe slowly we'll get back to that really important narrative of calling out the lack of powers that they have and pushing for more powers. There was also that issue around the biomass ban. Kind of seems like a blanket ban right across the country. I think it's biomass for cooking. I think that's been introduced, and a lot of people against that as well. What's your thoughts? So does this look like, you've been up in Aberdeen, does this look again a little bit like a kind of central belt bias, a lack of understanding, and how more rural communities use different form of heating and cooking and fueling and all things like that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I've been following this very slightly because it's maybe subsidiary to the bigger not meeting the climate targets thing. Yes, perhaps it is. Obviously, if you're living in very rural areas, that it's a completely different set of circumstances. But I haven't followed the legislation that closely, if I'm honest.
Yeah, it seems to be just another issue where maybe the current administration should have just listened a little bit more, or maybe even asked for a little bit more detail, because it's kind of the right thing to do when you're heading towards your climate targets, but it's not really done in the proper manner. And I don't think it's one of the first things that the Scottish Government should be doing. I think a bigger picture is that when we try and make really important moves towards improving the environment, impacting the climate, if we don't do it properly, it really gets people's backs up, and it makes it difficult afterwards to do more, to make bigger and more important changes. So it's been a little bit disappointing. I'd love your thoughts on any of what's been happening in Scotland the last week or so, or in general. We've got a wonderful interview with Stephanie. It's about 45 minutes. We've entitled it Growth and Inequality, but Karen, we covered so much more than that. We spoke about the global commodity markets, foreign direct investment, the role of women in the workplace, and kind of larger leading into some ideas of feminist economics. It's a wonderful interview. Also covered decolonialisation in Scotland and Britain's role in that. Loads going on. And if you haven't seen the little clip, it's towards the end of this interview when Stephanie just talks about actually how difficult it is for people to change because of the way that our brain's wired. Again, fascinating, wonderfully smart woman, really engaging. I hope you enjoy this episode, and we'll see you back at the end. Hello, Stephanie Seguino. Thank you so much for joining us on episode 99 of SCOTONOMICS.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Where are you at the moment?
I'm in Burlington, Vermont in the United States.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for joining Kieran in Aberdeen and me in Barcelona. Before we get into all the detail around inequality, and we're also going to look at growth and that relationship, could you just tell us a little bit about your background and why you're really interested in inequality?
You know, I think for many of us, some of our interests relate to our childhood experience. I am the granddaughter of 4 immigrant grandparents, and with all the struggles that required. I also grew up in a household with a very patriarchal Italian father who modeled his parenting style after Mussolini, I sometimes like to say. But, you know, in particular, in my 20s, I was an artist and trying to make a living. It wasn't particularly successful, but I had those interests then as well. And then I went to live in Haiti when I was working on my master's as an intern, and then worked for USAID. And I would say that experience of living in Haiti for 5 years was profoundly formative of what I pursued later on. And I think that when you see that degree, not only of inequality, but depth of poverty, it's something you can never forget. And it really just really energized me to commit myself to helping solve those issues, especially this was at the beginning of neoliberalism and Reagan's reign, and which really has undermined countries all over the world since then, the process of globalization. So those are the origins of my interests.
What time period was that?
It was just before Baby Doc was ousted, so mid-1980s to the late 1980s.
Yeah. And could you give us a picture of what Haiti was like at that period of time?
Well, you know, at that time, we used to say it couldn't get worse. And of course, it's gotten much worse since then. There's an extraordinarily high rate of malnutrition and early death amongst children below the age of 5. The effects of inequality and malnutrition were just so deeply entrenched in Haiti. I lived in Port-au-Prince, but I traveled all over the country. And quite frankly, you know, rural areas or urban areas, there was just profound poverty. And I'll just give you one example of it. When I first arrived in Haiti in 1984, the U.S. Embassy sent somebody to pick me up in a Jeep and drove me to the U.S. Embassy. And en route, we went through an area called La Saline. It was a slum. And it was 30 feet high pile of garbage in the middle of this slum that kids were picking through. Now imagine it was 95-degree weather and people were bathing in open sewers because of the lack of services. That, for me, tells the story of Haiti. It was very near the embassy, and where a lot of rich people hung out. So it was so striking to me that well-off people could actually ride by there every day and not feel motivated to do something, just ignored these people as though they were subhuman.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, years ago when I lived in London, I remember reading about Haiti, and actually that rape was the norm for women. It was expected that you would be raped. And, you know, what's really disturbing as well is that it's sitting next door to the Dominican Republic, you know, which is a holiday destination. And, you know, it couldn't be more different from what I could gather.
What did you see that was similar when you went back to the States, and what did you see that was different?
Well, I did my graduate work at American University in Washington, D.C., a great case of apartheid in which Black Washingtonians lived in Southeast Washington, an area I never visited across the Anacostia River because of the reports of how unsafe it was. I'm not sure that was really as true as I imagined, but I think it certainly, you know, separated those who were really deprived from the elite. And, you know, when you in Washington, D.C., they have a subway system, but the rich white folks in Georgetown, where Georgetown University is, refuse to have the subway go through their area to preserve it as a white elite area. So, you know, there are a lot of ways. You know, the inequality manifests in the United States. It may not appear so drastic, but quite frankly, I think if you look hard enough, it very much is.
As you highlighted there, a lot of that inequality is based on race.
In the United States, yes.
So how has that been a kind of contributing idea to the work that you've done over the last kind of quarter century?
Yeah, the work that I did initially in Haiti was working, we're doing research on coffee markets, and the U.S. wanted to eliminate all export taxes on coffee, which was one of the sole sources of revenue, and wanted Haiti to pursue an export-led growth model. And in Haiti, what the case was that they had a number of exporting firms that produced baseballs, Care Bears, goods that were entirely irrelevant to the lives of poor Haitians. And it was largely women that were employed in these industries at something like 50 cents a day. And, you know, for me, a really formative moment was when I had come back to the States in 1986 to visit my family. And on my way back, I was at the airport on a very, very cold February morning in Maine. And there was one other person in line, and he had a box that was addressed to himself in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. So I queried him and asked him what he was doing in Haiti. And he said he was manager of the shoe factory down the road in Maine. And it closed on Friday, was opening up in Port-au-Prince, Haiti on Monday. The hourly wage in Maine was $8.50 an hour at that time, as I recall. And the daily wage in Haiti, the daily wage was 50 cents a day. And so this was such an example of the impact of globalization, where firms are able to be mobile, to move from country to country, and often they exploited existing inequalities in the country. So in this particular case, gender inequality. That really stimulated my interest in doing research on South Korea, which was, you know, identified as a prime example of the benefits of export-led growth by the Reagan administration and others. And come to find out, which I discovered in my dissertation, is that Haiti was a case of gender exploitation as a mechanism for economic growth, where women were segregated into export industries. They therefore had very little bargaining power because it went alongside gender norms in Haiti, in which women were fired once they got married. So these women had a short job tenure. There was no incentive to train them or to move them up the job ladder. And they were disposable during economic downturns. You could easily shed them. And cultural norms were such that, you know, women weren't the primary earners, so it was okay to do that. Yeah. And so that really began my understanding of the role of inequality, not as a local micro problem, but as a macro issue, that inequality has macroeconomic effects, whether it's racial inequality or gender inequality. And it really began my effort to, I would say, theoretically address the shortcomings of mainstream macro to incorporate the role of inequality.
It's fascinating, and I know Haiti alone is not a standalone example. That is the business model for export-led growth, was the kind of precarious work that women were forced into or drawn into, which allowed these organizations and these countries to kind of push this idea of export-led growth. So that's an insight that's come from feminist economics. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about your involvement within that school of thought, and also some of the kind of basic tenets? Because a lot of people think that feminist economics is just a focus on the household on a very kind of micro level, but I think as you've highlighted there, there's huge insight into the macroeconomic world when you take this perspective of inequality.
Yeah. So this was really, I think this was the beginning of the subfield of gender and macroeconomics. And from a Kaleckian perspective, based on the work of Mikhail Kalecki, whose work was really about class divisions and how class inequality stimulated growth. Nobody had really thought about the role of gender inequality within the labor market as having a macroeconomic effect. And so myself, Alyssa Bronstein in particular, earlier work by Diane Elson, that really paved the way to developing macro models that incorporated gender inequality in the labor market. So gender job segregation as a factor in stimulating economic growth. Subsequent to that, some of my colleagues, including Alyssa and some other economists, began to think about the role of the care economy and how the investments in care, whether it's unpaid care work by women or publicly funded care by governments, also has a macroeconomic effect because it influences the productivity of the labor force, right? And as Alyssa often calls it, it's not about human capital, but human capacities. That is investment in children, in their socialization, and so forth, makes them not only intelligent, it doesn't develop just their cognitive skills, but social skills in a way that really has important macro effects. So those two branches of feminist economics have been fundamental. And I will say that, especially in reference to some work I've read recently, there's a misconception that feminist economics is about women. It is not about women. It is about relations between men and women, or women presenting people and male presenting people. And it is, so very, very often we can talk about men in terms of feminist economics. And overall, feminist economics is about the notion that that there should be no structural barriers to living a good life, regardless of your gender and regardless of your race, and the intersectionality of those two. So feminist economics also engages with racial inequality. And it is about a normative stance that there's no biological reason that some groups would have less, lower standards of living and less hopeful life conditions than other groups. Group inequality, in other words, is structurally created. It is not biologically created. And the goal of feminist economics and anti-racist economics is to understand the structural barriers that limit the ability for intergroup equality.
I also think that there's that difference between what's perceived as being valuable and the monetary reward. And millennia ago, when there was when societies were different, there was a role in care and development for the children in society, and then there was capturing the animals to be eaten, and there was no way that those two roles were seen as being more important or less important than each other. But through this idea of adding a monetary value to one of those areas, getting a resource, that's really where our society changed significantly and started to value one type of work over another. How important do you think it is as an economic discipline, and I suppose wider our societies, that we start to realize the value that's in the care society and realize that it's just as important as the other work that kind of takes place in that real economy where there's a monetary value or exchange?
You know, I think that the work of feminist economists for 25 years didn't have quite as much impact as COVID did. And it made all of us aware how deeply we need social connection and the role of care, which extends far beyond just raising children, emotional care of each other, care of the elderly, community care, and so forth. So that's what I think. I think that COVID really did us a huge favor in underscoring the fact and really overcoming the ideology and propaganda, if you will, of modern day neoclassical economics and capitalism, that somehow we're individuals and we get to where we are on our own energy. The fact is that we are interrelated. And so I think that there's more of there's more space now to argue for the importance of social connection and to argue for the role of social psychology and social norms and stereotypes in influencing our behavior. Economics has really just ignored that. I'm going to just talk for a moment about racial inequality. Racial inequality, the argument had been through scientific racism in the 1900s that there were biological differences between racial groups. But in reality, what we know, and what I now call myself as a stratification economist, is that racial hierarchies are socially created, and norms and stereotypes are used to cement those racial hierarchies. I do a lot of research now on racial profiling by the police, and that is driven by negative stereotypes about African Americans in the United States, for example, or immigrants in Europe, for example, that somehow they're deficient, that they're criminal, that they're threatening. All of these stereotypes, so we can't, as economists, we can't just stick to this notion of human rationality. That is such a small bit of how we meet the world. And so this issue is relevant for gender as well. Gender norms and stereotypes shape, as you said, the devaluation of so-called women's work and elevate the value of so-called male work. And it's through an acculturation process that this happens. So I'm really committed to a broader economics that is integrated with sociology and social psychology for a more fully, a fuller representation of what human nature is.
I heard a report recently, maybe a few weeks ago, that women, working class women, just generally don't ask for pay rises. I don't know how it is in the States. I think when I say working class, I have an American friend who we talk about different stratas of wages. She doesn't like to talk about class in America, but it certainly exists. We know this realistically. And I have to admit, I'm ashamed to tell you that the first time I asked for a wage rise, I think I was 49, and I was refused that wage rise. And, I think a lot of women are reluctant to get into that kind of conversation. And the other thing I wanted to ask you as well is, have you got champions within the unions or within the political class who are running with your research?
To the issue of women not asking for higher wages, I think we can't forget that actually women are punished if they are too assertive. There's some evidence that shows that women that ask for higher wages are in fact treated treated very poorly as a result of that. So the fact that women don't ask for higher wages is a socialization process from the past, but also the present. This is what they meet. I'm working on a gender discrimination case now, in which a school teacher, actually she's an athletic director, went to her superintendent and had done a survey of area athletic directors who were primarily male, reported that she was getting paid substantially less. And what the superintendent said to her is, well, we can't afford to pay you that. And if you want to insist, then we're going to re-advertise the job and you'll have to apply for it again. So again, often in these things, in these issues, that women are often blamed, if you will, for their behavior. Somehow they're responsible for it, but they're not responsible for it in the sense that they've already experienced the punishment for acting in a way that is not consistent with rigid gender roles. With regard to your question about whether there are champions, I'm happy to say that I've done a lot of work with the AFL-CIO in the United States. They have really done a lot of work on gender, and I think unions in the United States are becoming much more progressive in terms of gender as well as race. And as you probably know, in the United States, unions were incredibly exclusionary of women and Black folks. So this is a welcome change. We have theoretically advocates at the World Bank. The World Bank is not a uniform organization. It's not monolithic. So although the gender folks might be pushing for gender equality, the macro folks are, if anything, impervious at this stage. On the other hand, the UN has done phenomenal work in promoting the gender and macro research that we've done and in using it in their policies, whether it's UN Women or UNDP or UNCTAD and other organizations. So I would say that, progress has been made. And I think we are, one of the areas that's been hardest to make progress is with heterodox male economists who are Marxian or Kaleckian and so forth. And it has really taken a long time to get them to pay attention to this work and integrate it. And it's slowly happening. Change is slow, but it's a marathon.
You're seeing a change in the States over, let's say from, I would imagine a good place to start would be the Black Lives Matters period. Has there been a significant development in the awareness and the recognition of women and minorities' rights?
I don't think for U.S. underrepresented groups, that meaning African Americans and Hispanics and Native Americans in particular. That work has been more around policing. George Floyd murder in 2020 really energized a lot of people to think about structural racism. So I'm going to take that back. I think there has been more awareness of structural racism, but the focus in addressing it has largely been with regard to policing, to some extent housing, unfair access to bank loans, for example, but not a lot of change there. With regard to women, I think the valuation of care work has increased, but what's really happened in the United States, at least, is that it's not only unions, although, as you know, unions have really become activated in the last few years in a great way, but it's also the labor shortage that was created by COVID. So just can't convert this into pounds easily, but the minimum wage here in Burlington at the beginning of COVID was roughly $10 or $11 an hour. In the middle of COVID, when hotels and restaurants couldn't find workers easily, that pay is now $18 an hour and up to $20 an hour. So almost, 50% increase because of that. And that's been the biggest shift, is the impact of COVID. COVID has done a lot for gender relations and racial equality, because a lot of those folks doing that kind of work are people of color, women of color, for example. So that's been the leverage, I think. I think change is slow. I'm working on some court cases that, the courts are Neanderthal. Even though we have equal pay laws, it is very difficult to prosecute gender pay discrimination cases. So, and that's partly for the fact that Trump appointed a lot of very conservative judges. So our judicial system has gone backwards, even though political awareness has increased. So those are the complex and contradictory factors that are going on here now.
I wanted to take a slightly broader look now and go back to this idea, this connection between inequality and economic growth. So what's your perception, or your research has told us that when a country grows initially and then medium term and then long term, what's the relationship with inequality?
It's really so interesting. And I would say that the research I've done shows that that relationship differs by economic structure. Export-led growth economies, what I would call semi-industrialized economies like Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, to some extent Mexico, some Central American countries, for example, where export-led growth, export manufacturing is key. Inequality is a stimulus to growth. Why is that? Because low wages for workers in those industries lowers export prices, or allows producers to lower their prices, and allows them to gain a higher market share in global markets. That generates foreign exchange that can be used to purchase the imports needed to move up the industrial ladder. And so inequality is a stimulus to growth. And that's really the work that I did on South Korea and semi-industrialized economies in general. On the other hand, if you take, so I'm going to ignore rich countries because I think it's a different can of worms. But if you look at low-income agricultural economies in sub-Saharan Africa, in some places in South Asia, and so forth, the gender job segregation differs. And in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, women are subsistence farmers, so they feed their children. Men have the cash crops. So one of the things that would happen in sub-Saharan Africa, if you had higher wages for women, which, you know, there's not a lot of waged work, but some people do work off farm to be able to buy the inputs for their agriculture, that those higher wages or higher education, so in other words, greater gender equality in education or wages, helps on-farm production and helps food production, which reduces import demand and improves the balance of payments. And typically, women in all countries tend to invest more in their children. So in those countries where gender equality is a stimulus to growth, it happens in terms of farm production, food production, but also in the long run development of cognitive skills for children, because more of the household income is spent on them. So depending upon the structure of the economy, inequality may be a stimulus to growth or have a negative impact on growth. If you look at the slave economy in the United States, well, slavery was a stimulus to economic growth. It meant cheaper goods that manufacturers in the North could purchase and therefore afford lower wages for their workers in the North. The question is whether inequality in the short run can lead to growth in the long run. Maybe it does. Inequality may stimulate short-run growth. Can it stimulate long-run growth? My answer to that is Haiti. Haiti has been exploited for years by the elites, by the French as colonialists, and later by the Haitian elite. And what you see is an incredibly depleted peasant class whose cognitive abilities have suffered as a result of this. And it will take enormous investments over generations to bring Haiti back to a place where poor Haitians can achieve the productivity, if you will, that they would otherwise have had absent years of exploitation. So, you know, how long is the long run? I don't know. It's not sustainable. I think we can argue that inequality is not sustainable for many reasons that I haven't mentioned. You know, I'll give you an example from Haiti, that in Haiti, land tenure is very insecure. It's a deeply deforested country. Peasants that don't have secure access to the land, that is, poor peasants that can't read or write, and whose land can easily be expropriated by local elites, are not willing to adopt deforestation methods. They're not willing to plant fast-growing trees because they know that they won't reap the benefits of that. So there's a lot of myriad effects of the impact of inequality on economic growth. But the work that I did, and I think some of us feminist economists, shows that exploitation is successful in the short run, especially in an export-oriented economy.
Yeah.
Whether that is racially segregated or gender segregated.
You touched a little bit on the kind of colonial role in the propagation of inequality. So if we are thinking about the British Empire being similar to the French colonial experience, how would you say that's affected or still affected a country like the United Kingdom in terms of our inequality and our growth? Should we be taking a much more global historical perspective of where the United Kingdom is in terms of its wealth as an economy and how we got there?
First of all, what I think that globalization has done is pitted workers against each other in the global north and the global south. It's been very easy for demagogues to, say immigrants are the problem, or these poor countries that are erecting trade barriers are the problem. But the reality, and to some extent that is true, that is by corporations being able to move to the lowest wage country, it is leading to downward pressure on wages in the UK and other places. That is a phenomenon that has been documented. The wage share of income in Europe and the United States has declined substantially since the onset of globalization because of competition from poor workers in other countries. But of course, poor workers are not the problem. The problem is mobile capital that is essentially change the rules of the game so that it can move around the globe seeking the lowest wages, the least environmental standards, and so forth. And the real challenge is to make common cause between workers in the global south and workers in the global north. But that gap has been exploited by the right wing to blame outsiders and as the culprit rather than corporations. I happen to live in the state of Bernie Sanders, our only socialist in Congress, who is one of the only people who have identified multinational corporations as at the root of some of this inequality. So so first of all, I think that. I also think that, it has made it easy to ignore history, the impact of history on developing countries. Why are there immigrants coming to Europe in boatloads or across the US border? What role have our governments played in terms of their macroeconomic policies that have impoverished these countries and forced these immigrants to move across borders? The United States has supported dictatorships in Central America for decades. The Chiquita Banana Company, I mean, you can name these corporations, including in Haiti, in which they support right-wing violent governments that have led to the destitution of these countries today, and that's why we have these immigrants pouring across our borders. Same thing in West Africa and in other parts of Africa. So we have supported dictators in those countries. I don't know if you remember Mobutu, who was the dictator in Zaire, now the Congo, for years. And when Mobutu died, the value of his Swiss bank account was equal to the external debt of Zaire. And we continued to lend them money, knowing this because corporations had access to the resources that they had. So colonialism is not over. It is just continuing under a different name, whether it's in Angola or South Africa or in many other countries of the world in which we are extracting resources. I don't know if I've pontificated enough on that.
Well, I knew we were going to have a really wide-ranging conversation. I did warn you about that. So Thank you so much. I know you did touch on the role of global capital, and we can also call it, which is a much nicer term, foreign direct investment. So by the name that you can tell that when someone is investing in your country, it's for your benefit, it's not for their benefit because they're investing. So what do you think is the actual role and the impact of foreign direct investment in the developing world? Is it a really incredibly positive thing, or is there some negative aspects to it as well?
Well, I think it's negative in the current form, right? With the current structure that we have, I think it's negative. So I want to answer this in two parts because it's not just foreign direct investment that's going on today. It is global commodity chains, if you will. And so I'm going to talk about foreign direct investment first. I'm going to talk about global commodity change, which I think is equal, if not more important, as a problem promoting inequality globally. So foreign direct investment, one of the problems of foreign direct investment is the rules have changed, whereby in the past, foreign corporations, multinational corporations were required to retain a share of their profits in the country that they were investing in. And there were some local content requirements. That meant that they needed to source some of their inputs from the local economy. So there were backward linkages and a stimulus to growth. The way that foreign direct investment has happened, I'm going to say just in the manufacturing sector, is that in the case of Haiti or in the case of the Caribbean, right, they fly in the components that are being assembled, and all they're doing is relying on local labor to assemble this. They push for no unions, so workers aren't able to get higher wages. And quite frankly, even if workers got higher wages, because of the abolishment of rules, if you will, on the mobility of capital, by I mean physical capital around the world, a company can just pick up today and move to another country with lower wages if the government was stupid enough to raise wages, as happened in Haiti under Aristide in 1990 or 1991, I recall. So foreign capital's mobility gives it greater bargaining power relative to local, to workers locally. Workers are not mobile, although they are trying to be in some places. They're not mobile, but capital is. So they have enormous bargaining power. And that is the key feature of globalization that has made it less beneficial. Let me add also that they often say that, there's technology transfer. It's beneficial to the local economy. Not true. Foreign direct investment, foreign firms, multinational firms typically don't bring their cutting edge technology to countries. They bring older technology because they don't want to share the secrets. And so the countries that have benefited from foreign direct investment, like South Korea, was a country that had firm restrictions on foreign direct investment. It said, you have to share your technology with us. There was an RFP proposals requested by the South Korean government years ago for a high-speed train from Seoul to Busan. And they got bids from France and Japan and whoever else, and basically said, whoever we give the bid to has to be willing to share with us their patents and their technology for producing trains for this railroad. So they forced technology sharing because they were in a bargaining position to do that. Most developing countries are not able to do that. The other problem with this, of course, is capital is mobile, and therefore investment is unstable. Firms don't therefore have an investment. These foreign firms don't have an investment in investing in high-skilled workers and long-term investments. It's largely these, more labor-intensive skills. There's some exceptions to that with motor vehicle companies and so forth, but I'll leave that aside. But I want to just talk about global commodity chains. So if you take a company like Apple doesn't, and a lot of, so there are two types of global commodity chains. There are producer-driven and buyer-driven commodity chains. So let me talk about buyer-driven commodity chains. I think that you have some big supermarkets, for example, or Walmart, for example, that don't produce, they buy. And what do? Walmart might call up, it has buyers all over the world. It might call up its buyers in El Salvador, and that they will say, find some subcontractors that will produce us 10,000 pairs of jeans in 2 weeks at this price with this type of denim. They talk to the subcontractors, say, we can't afford to produce it at that lower price. Subcontractor says, the agent for Walmart says, no problem. I'll call another country where they are, or another subcontractor where they are willing to pay me lower wages, willing to give me this at a lower price. So again, it's bargaining down. So even if these firms, these locally owned firms in poor countries were willing to pay a good wage, they can't afford to because the global commodity chains the buyers will simply buy from someplace else. Similar with producer-driven commodity chains. So again, Ford, who am I thinking of? Apple, large manufacturers of goods, they source their parts from all over the world. So a Ford car isn't produced in the United States anymore. It has component parts all over the world, and the buyer, the producers will play off workers in one country against the other. A number of years ago, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal about, I think it was Volkswagen that was producing in Spain, and it told its workers in Spain, accept a wage cut or we're moving, I don't know what part they were producing for Volkswagen. They said, oh, we're moving to Poland. Well, guess what? Workers accepted a lower wage. So global commodity change. So it doesn't have to be foreign direct investment, right? It is these large companies in these large corporations in rich countries that are really driving the global inequality in terms of wages and employment. You know, I'm going to make a confession to you. I did work on this topic of capital mobility, and found that productivity growth was greater in countries that restricted firm mobility, right? Not just financial capital, but firm mobility. And I have been asking myself, you know, when was I going to do the research to look at what the policy implications of this are? And I have not done that. So it's something I've never gotten back to, and I think is really important. I do think there are some examples of it, but they would have to be the governments that are relatively powerful in the global south. So Brazil, India, for example. China already does some restrictions, that they have the bargaining power to restrict. I think UNCTAD is an organization that could mobilize the least developed countries to be able to erect these barriers. And I think that you want to be able to slow the movement of capital across borders, whether it's financial or physical. But I haven't quite figured out what the exact policy solutions are. So for any PhD students that are listening to this, I think it's really ripe area. I think that some people have done work in this area, but I've been stymied because the issues really are at the WTO and in bilateral trade agreements. That's really where the problem is. It is ultimately a political problem at this point. We have the evidence of what has been beneficial in the past. And so I think that there are policy solutions that have been abandoned that could be resurrected, but there might be others. Global commodity change are the real problem. I think it's really hard to support subcontractors in poor countries if you have this global sourcing by these large corporations that can source from anywhere. And I've often thought that, you know, what has happened that during the golden age of capitalism, from 1945 to roughly 1975, you had the rise of unions, wage workers, the wage share of income was rising, and it was a win-win. The higher wages stimulated productivity growth, and it was a win-win scenario. And I felt like in the 1970s and the 1980s with Reagan and Thatcher and the freeing of capital from its embeddedness in local economies, that local labor unions, workers lost their power. They've lost their bargaining power. And our solution is global labor agreements, whether it is labor standards or globalized unions and so forth. And that's a long, long haul in terms of organization. But the goal is essentially counterbalancing the power of corporations. And it may, in fact, have to come through governments rather than global labor unions, which is a really hard sell.
I wanted to just finish with your views on the climate crisis and how this is affecting global inequality, considering the impact on the global south and relating that to the lack of carbon that was emitted by those countries of the global south. So in summary, huge impacts without any of the kind of benefits. How do you think we need to analyze inequality on a global scale when we're considering the climate crisis?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, I think in any kind of crisis like this, it is the most vulnerable who bear the impact because they have the least resources to weather these storms, the less ability to address climate issues in their own land or their own communities and so forth. The issue of the the global, well, and this is true in the United States as well. It's not just between poor countries and rich countries, but let's talk about poor countries and rich countries. There's a principle in environmental economics which says, let the polluter pay. And I remember making that comment at the United Nations in response to the Asian financial crisis, I believe it was, or one of the crises, I don't recall. It was the Great Recession. That's what it was. And poor countries were really bearing the cost of that due to the downturn in the rich countries and so forth. But that notion of let the polluter pay applies, economically, but especially with regard to the environment. And that's what's so interesting about neoclassical economics, because, normally they would argue that you need to own your own behavior, but they have not been willing to be advocates for that. The only thing I can say about that is that we can't get anywhere on the climate crisis until the rich countries actually pony up and fund the majority of the costs of the transition, whether it's in our countries or in the global South. I'm social scientist for a reason. Since I was a kid, I've always often thought about these issues. And one of the things that I recognized early on in my life is that human beings have a prefrontal cortex that makes them wise and analytical, but they are unable to address change until there's a crisis. And that's what's happening right now, is these global climate crises in the United States. I mean, Vermont has been seeing enormous flooding. We thought we were immune here. All over the United States, we've seen these terrible events, as well as all over the world. But, quite frankly, we don't pay attention to typhoons in Indonesia or climate crises in other places because it's far away. And we are the ones that need to take action. So as this climate crisis comes home to roost in the rich countries, I think there's going to be more incentive to address the problems. But I'm an optimistic person, but this one is really discouraging me. My undergraduate degree was in political science. Then I thought, no, it's economics that's going to change the world. And I'm coming back to thinking that politics is really important. And with regard to this, we have the climate crisis on one hand. We also have the enormous increase in economic insecurity amongst white men, for example, the dominant group, if you will, in rich countries. And one of the areas that I've explored in recent years is neuroscience, brain neuroscience, and how the brain functions. And one of the things I've come to understand is that economic insecurity, physical insecurity, shuts down the wise analytical prefrontal cortex and triggers the limbic system, the fight, flight, or freeze mechanism. And so we have global populations who are in a state of fright and fear, and less able to reason, and it makes them much more susceptible to demagogues like Donald Trump, I could go on and name all of the right-wing leaders, Modi and others around the world. And so what that has done is, instead of addressing the climate crisis, instead of cohering as communities, we are now pointing the finger at people of color, pointing the finger at refugees and immigrants, pointing the finger at the media, and so on and so forth. So in some ways, we know the solutions, but we are not in a political scenario right now to be able to cohere around those solutions because of the fear and anxiety that has been created largely by globalization.
No, I think that's fascinating, Stephanie, because you've just basically said all of the things that would never even be on the horizon of a mainstream economist. Thank you so much for spending time with us. I've learned a lot from that. I'm sure our audience will really enjoy that conversation as well. Thank you for your time, Stephanie.
Well, thank you so much. It was really great talking to you. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye now. Welcome back, Karen. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed that interview. Plenty of comments there, which is good to see. Karen, on watching that back again, anything you want to mention before we jump off air?
Yeah, I thought it was really, really good for our audience to be reminded that the COVID underscoring our interrelatedness. And, you know, I wrote that article last week for the National to just try and make the point that, you know, a currency is also about our interrelatedness and our abilities to rely on each other, and really seeing it as a tool that helps us to do that. So I thought that was quite interesting. Wage rises, women are punished if they're too assertive. Yeah, I've certainly experienced that. Inequality is a stimulus of growth. You know, we have concerns about growth in any case, but you know that she's saying that's also a stimulus for inequality is another thing to be wary of when it's almost brought up by many in the political classes, a panacea for everything.
Yeah, no, they're really important points to pick out. Thanks so much for everyone for joining us this evening. It's the 22nd today, isn't it? I'm just thinking, do we have one show before the end of the month? I think we do. I think we've got another episode next week. We won't be back on the first Monday of May, but we'll have a show next week. Hopefully we'll be interviewing an Australian author who's written a wonderful book called Alice, which is one of the most important untold stories about money. I'm halfway through it. It's absolutely amazing. So hopefully I'll be able to interview him before the end of the week, and we'll have that episode with you next week. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll hopefully see you again next week. Bye for now.
Good night.